Now let us continue to discuss about the artificial neural network. Okay, artificial neural network, it's inspired from the biological human brain. As you can see, this is a single cell that what we call as a neuron in our brains. It consists of dendrites, axon and synapse. And as you can see that this single neuron, the purpose of dendrites there is to transfer the electrical stimulus or electrical signals to the neuron, and then you can see the axon there is the output. So the input here, where actually this input come from the stimulus from the previous from the previous the adjacent neuron or from the sensor, which is converted into electrical signal and flow to dendrite, and from that dendrite it will either activate the center of the neuron or not activate. Is depend on the brain itself whether that information is important or not. Once that electrical signal go, and later it will give us some firing, or that is what we call as activate the neuron, and then that activate neuron will firing the signal through the axons, and that signals will go to the synapse. Actually the synapse actually will transfer that electrical signal to another adjacent neuron, where actually the one that accept that signal is dendrite from another from another or the adjacent neuron. So that's how the neurons work. So again, this is a single neurons, it's just a single neuron, so that's why it consists of these three main components. Okay, so if we talk about a set of neural network there, which is like this one, you can see that, just assume this stimulus is come from your sensor. Doesn't matter your eyes, your ears. If you talk about the ears, the stimulus is come from in term of voice or sounds. So your ears will convert that sound into electrical signal. If you talk about your eyes, then your vision there, when you see anything, it will convert that analog signal in environment into electrical signal and go to this dendrite there. So from this dendrite, and then the center of the neurons there will choose either to activate or not. So there's some filter there. If the information from this area is not important, let's say, but this one is important, then this one will activate or firing, and this one is not firing. So the one is firing will pass the signal through this axon. The one that is not firing, it will not pass the information through the axon, because they find out this, for example, this information from this stimulus and this stimulus is not important as compared to the one that you get from here. So the one that you get from here will pass. So that's why you can see that the center of neuron here is the purpose is to filter out which one is important, which one is not important. So the neuroscience community find out that when the human try to do something, for example, try to do any behavior, human behavior, or try, for example, let's say, ask the subject to recognize something, they find out they has different recognition process will activate different neuron location. So that's why it seems to be the brain itself actually have a lot of electrical information that have been filtered out by each and every neuron, because they want the brain want to find a pattern to recognize something. So of course this is the example of when you ask human to recognize something based on the picture. For example, you ask how actually you know that picture show let's say a dog, or the picture show a cat. So they find out this network or this neuron is activate differently. So means that the electrical signal that have been firing or have been passed through the each neuron is different as compare if you because of different information, and then and lastly then you might recognize that. So in other words, we from that idea, so the neuroscience community try to model the behavior of this neuron or the behavior of your brain, because they find out that each different activity will make different neuron location activate. So that's why each neuron here should or can be modeled as some equation that can represent this behavior of this neuron, and then from that the neuroscience community try to model this a single unit of your brain, which is called a neuron, in mathematic expression, and from there they find out it can be expressed, a single neuron can be expressed as this equation, where this is the single neuron, and in some book they call it as a node, and each node here will have two functions. Okay, there's a two function. One is called as an input function. This is called as an input function, and F here is called as an activated function. So, and you find out that this is the axon, means that the axon, this axon is from the adjacent neuron that you get from the previous. I mean that the previous neuron will pass the signal. If that neuron is firing, that signal will go through the axon of that neuron. Of course, this is you just assume there's another neurons there. So that neuron is firing, and that's why that signal is go through the axon of this neuron. So from that behavior, then people in neuroscience use the variable x to represent that signal, where that means that x is come from the signals or the input signal of this neuron, and then inside that neuron, this one will become your dendrites, which is if you remember, dendrite is this part. Okay, this part. So meaning that you have a axon from the other network. There's a network there. I'm sorry, there's a neurons there. This is the axon from other network, and then this neuron will have a synapse. That synapse is connected to dendrite of this neuron. So that's why you can see that in mathematic model, this is dendrite, this is the axon from another neuron, and then that the synapse will connect between the previous neuron and this current neuron through the dendrites of this neuron. So from that mathematical equation, they find out that they try to model what actually happened in single unit of neuron is actually can be represented in this block diagram, where this neuron, this node consists of two functions. One is input function, the other one is activated function. So you can see that this input function is a linear function that we discussed before. It's a linear function where you have a weight there, means that this weight actually will control how strong this signal is, how important this signal is, meaning that if this one is big, then it means that this XO is important. For example, let's say X0 is bigger than X1 and X2. That's meaning this information X0 is more important than this one and this one, because the one that control the how influence the pattern is, how important that signal is depend on your W. So it's look like your brains there, meaning that your brain is that is represented by this dendrites, because dendrites will determine how much important that signal is inside your. So the dendrites will choose which branch is important to be selected to be passed through and go into this nucleus there. So so to represent that dendrites, they put it as a W there, where this W will control which one will dominate, which one is important. So that's why you call the W also as well as a weight, how heavy that signal is important as compared to the rest. So it's depend on that W. And then you also have the activation function there. Activation function here is it's represent this nucleus, because inside this nucleus, before it can firing that signal pass through the axon to pass to the next neuron, is depend on whether this neuron is activate or firing or not. So that behavior is replaced by this activation function, meaning that if your output at the input function here is big enough, that make that the function, the activation function, activate or firing the signal to the axon function. So you can see that you need to have another functions there that will become like a pipe, or if you imagine a pipeline there, this one is like a gate, or gate function, means that gate can be closed or not. If this output from the input function is strong enough, then you can't, gate will open, this gate will open, because this F is depend on the input from the input functions there. So that's why they call it activate function, means that this function might activate or might not activate. What is the meaning might not activate? When you don't have strong enough value to activate this function. So from this one, if you see the patterns there, remember that when I again draw this equation, draw this block, okay, sorry, okay, if you remember during my last lecture, I always like to draw this block. So why I always like to highlight this block is because at that time we never discuss about neural network on a single unit of neuron yet. So that's why I always discuss in this shape. You can see that this shape, this one is represent your linear, sorry, okay, this one represent your linear function, and this one is represent your non-linear function. Okay, again this block, if you change the F, then you can have a lot of variety of function, from the linear regression into logistic regression, or linear method for multi-class classification. So if you change this F, so if you talk about a neuron, actually this model is actually a single unit of neuron. Okay, whereby this one in this lecture, this is known as input function, and this is known as activated function. So imagine that one single neuron can represent either linear regression, can represent logistic regression, can represent perceptron algorithm, or can represent a linear method for multi-class classification if you define the activation function in different type of form. If you talk about linear regression, then your activation function we must set your activation function as identity function. If you want to make sure that this unit neuron behave like logistic regression, then you must set this activation function as a sigmoid function. And if you want to this single neuron to behave like a perceptron algorithm, then you must set your f here, or the activation function here, as a unit step function. So in neural network, actually this operation, or this that what you have learned before, is represented by this single unit neuron. So then you can imagine that how powerful your brain is, meaning that what you have learned before is just only a single neuron of your brain. So imagine that if if you cascade this block into many if you have several or million of single neuron, and then you connect it together, make it as a network like that, then you have a powerful, or in other words, a complicated function, which given a very complicated relation between input and output, still that network have capable to recognize, because of they actually is a collection of for example, logistic regression, several logistic regression, you are cascading together and you networking together, you make a network together, so you have a huge number of logistic regression to recognize that problem. So that's why artificial neural network is very powerful as compared to linear regression, logistic regression that you learned before, because that is only a single unit of artificial neural network. Because later we will see that when we cascade several neural network, it might work better as compared to the previous one, because of this because you are from the linear, you cascade with f, it become non-linear, and then again if you have a huge collection of non-linear function, you cascade all this function together, it should be work better than before in finding the meaningful information, in finding a good pattern to recognize or to predict something. Okay, so but this is just a reminder. Be very careful with your analogies, meaning that artificial neural network is inspired by how the brain work, but do not say that it's work like human brain. So that's why we still have disadvantage, or there's still a drawback in artificial neural network, because when the neuroscience to try to model the behavior of single neuron, they just assume that that single neuron actually consists of two functions. One is a linear function, another one is a non-linear, means that you are cascading between linear function and non-linear function, which is also known as cascading between the input function and activation function to represent the neuron. But biologically, that is not how the brains work, because in practical we cannot say that it's work like human brain. So that's why we still have drawback in your artificial neural network is still don't accurately recognize something, and still have a limitation, because we just do some assumption, but that assumption is good in recognizing many things and solve many things, but still cannot compete with the human brain. It's just mimic a part of human brain behavior of the human brain. And that is the reality. For the biological neurons, there's many different types, and then the dendrites they can perform complex non-linear computation. However, in our perspective, we assume is just a linear equation there, but it's not. In biological dendrite, it can perform a complex non-linear computation, and then the synapse are not a single wake, but a complex non-linear dynamic system. So that is also still cannot be modeled by the neuroscience. We just simply make for each neuron we have two function. One is an input function, another one is activated function, and then that's why the rate code may not be adequate there.